Okay, my name is Yuri Ostrovsky. I work at Statistics Canada. I know it's late, so I'll try to make this presentation quick and reasonably painless. I think it's fair to say that one of the most researched topics in labor economics is immigrant earnings. And particularly economists are interested in why immigrants are paid less than comparative native-born. And one of the things that we've learned in the last 10, 15, 20 years is that immigrants work in different firms. Immigrants and natives work in different firms. So the literature talks about sorting. The literature talks about immigrants sorted and being sorted into the so-called low-paying immigrant firms. And the literature also talks about the negative correlation between workplace immigrant concentration earnings. And because we're economists, we usually think in terms of skills and productivity. And I think the way it's usually presented is that the sorting takes place primarily with respect to wages. So the reason these low-paying immigrant firms are low-paying, and the reason these low-paying immigrant firms are immigrant is because they're low-paying. And if you read the literature, you read something like the last bullet, where the authors say it's likely that the negative correlation between workplace immigrant concentration and earnings reflects selection rather than causality. And note the word likely. First of all, it's likely. It hasn't really been carefully looked at. And the other thing, what I'm trying to argue is that it's I have no problem with that. I think there's a lot of evidence that says that sorting takes place with respect. It mainly takes place at the wage level. But what I'm also trying to say is that there may be the causality may be running both ways. So it's quite possible that, to put it simply, that low-paying immigrant firms are immigrant because they're low-paying, and being immigrant is the end result of this process. But it's also possible, and I will give you a few scenarios, that they're low-paying because they're immigrant. So that's basically the main goal of this study. There's another goal, and I'm not going to talk about it. So one obvious mechanism. So I'm not smart enough to think about a complicated theoretical model, but if you think about, you can think about several scenarios, right? So one obvious scenario is we know that a lot of immigrants have preferences for working with other immigrants, particularly with their co-ethnics. Feng has a study that says that those who work with their co-ethnics, they're happier. It varies across different variables. It varies across immigrant characteristics. So for some immigrants, it's stronger. For some immigrants, it's weaker. But if you believe that immigrants have preferences for working with other immigrants, then they should be willing to pay premium on working with other immigrants. And so, the important thing for this study is that in this case, in this scenario, sorting takes place not with respect to earnings, but it takes place with respect to workplace immigrant concentration, and which in turn affects earnings. If you read sociology, I think in others, if you're an economist and you accidentally read sociological papers, I think sociologists recognize that there's a much greater, I think sociological literature recognizes the potential for causality to run from workplace immigrant concentration to earnings. So for example, sociological literature talks about this bargaining process that takes place at workplace, and there are different actors. There are managers and firm owners and immigrant workers and native workers and union and all the rest of them. And there's bargaining, and your bargaining power depends on your social status. And because immigrants' social status presumably lower than the social status of other actors, then the higher the workplace immigrant concentration, the lower is the ability of different actors to make wage claims. So they make fewer wage claims, and there's a higher probability that these wage claims are going to be rejected. And so you can, and again, in this scenario, employers who recognize this, they use workplace immigrant concentration, or they can use the workplace immigrant concentration as a tool for controlling wages. So this is another mechanism that I think establishes this causal link between workplace immigrant concentration and earnings. And if you're an economist, you know, and you're thinking, oh, come on, Yuri, do we really have to pay attention to sociologists? Well, well, first of all, we do. And second, there's an economics literature that basically says that if you're an immigrant truck driver, for example, and when you think about your wages, you compare yourself not to an average truck driver, but you compare yourself to another immigrant truck driver, and in particular, the truck driver who works in the same company. And if everybody is paid less, it's easier for you to accept lower wages. Again, if you're an employer, you recognize it, then you use it as a tool to control wages. Now, before I tell you how I go about establishing the causal link between workplace immigrant concentration and earnings, just a few other things. So first of all, seed is wonderful. You heard that today. And it's not, well, we usually say, well, it's a data set. It's not really a data set. It's a data environment with different pieces. And you can, the biggest challenge was to make all these pieces fit together so they can link them in different ways. And it's like a Lego set where there are all these different pieces, but they all fit together. So the major challenge was to make all of them linkable. And we did that. And there are different administrative components. And of course, the strength of SEED is that it covers the whole population, and it covers all the firms, all firms in Canada. And you can always make wonderful thing even more wonderful. And so recently, we actually were able to link SEED to census. It's kind of a joint effort of a lot of people at Stats Canada, but it's now possible. And so this is one of the, I think, first project that actually tries to use this link with the census. So I use, first of all, I don't need all these SEED components. I need only 3 components. I need T4, which is records of remuneration. If you're not Canadian, then it's, I think in the States, it's like W2. So at the end of the year, you get this slip, which record of your employment, and employers also have to submit it to the revenue agency. And so that's part related to annual earnings and so on. And then there's NUMF, which is business level data. And if you link them together, you have everybody who works in a particular firm. So you have information about the workplace. And then you link it to IMDb, which is immigration database, and you have information about immigrants. The problem with all these administrative files, they're all wonderful, but they have serious limitations, and it doesn't matter how many admin files you put together, they still have the same limitations. For example, there's no information about education. There's no information about hourly wages. There's no information about hours of work. There's no information about working full-time and part-time. So SEED has a lot of limitations too, even though it's magical and wonderful. So by linking SEED to census, you can get a lot of this information for workers. I'm not going to, so these are all standard sort of sample selection things. One thing that I should mention is that one of the problems with seed is that information is collected at the enterprise level, and there's no way to see what's going on at the establishment level. So establishment is basically the physical location. So if you're thinking about McDonald's, right? So the establishment is the particular McDonald's restaurant at 37 Elm Street, but the enterprise is McDonald's, and in seed there's no really way to see what's going on at the establishment level. So this is bad news. The good news is that you can identify single establishment firms, and again, there's a good news and bad news. The good news is that I think something like the vast majority of firms in Canada are single establishment firms. The bad news is that 1% that are multi-establishment firms employs like half of all workers. But because of all this conceptual argument that I make in the paper is relevant to the establishment level, I limit my sample to the single establishment enterprises, which are smaller, but I think that's the way to do it. So I'm not going to say so. One of the things is, how do you measure workplace immigrant concentration? And recent literature uses exposure. They just call it exposure, right? But essentially it's exposure to immigrant workers, to immigrant colleagues. So exposure is essentially share of immigrants among your coworkers. So it's computed for each individual, but it's different for immigrants and non-immigrants in the same firm. So it's the share of immigrants among your coworkers, excluding yourself. And there are good reasons to use it. There are papers that discuss advantages and disadvantages of using it, but it's a measure that has a lot of advantages. So I said that, so this is basically the very basic setup. I'm interested in the effect of exposure on immigrant earnings, and primarily on immigrant earnings. And an obvious problem is that C here, exposure, is endogenous. So how do I approach the issue of endogeneity in two ways? The first way is kind of a standard traditional way. It's using NIV, and I could think about two IVs, and I don't know what you think about them. One is, imagine that you live in Montreal and work in construction, right? So one IV is, so imagine that there are also immigrants who live in Montreal and work in construction. So think about this area industry cell. Now, the first instrument is if you take the commuting distance, and there's information about it in census. If you take the commuting distance for every immigrant and you calculate some measure of dispersion for all immigrants in this cell, the dispersion of commuting distances, you can certainly make an argument that the workplace exposure is negatively related to the dispersion of to the dispersion of distances that immigrant commute in this area industry cell. So I think there is a paper, I think I read the paper that talks about it, but I just can't find it in, I have to dig deep. But this is I haven't worked, this is something I've been working on recently, and it's kind of a really new project, so I have to, there's still a lot of things that have to be sorted out. So I have to find the citation for, and then the second instrument is, so there's a lot of studies that basically tell us that workplace concentration depends on residential concentration. obviously you can't use residential concentration as an instrument because it's not exogenous. So but what you can do is you can go back 10 years and use 2006 census and calculate, again, you think about the area industry cell, and you calculate the share of immigrants in this cell, and you can think the reasons why it can be an exogenous source of exogenous variation in exposure. So that's one way to think about it. The other way to approach endogeneity, there's a more recent literature. It was started by Altonji, Elder, and Tabor, and it's about. So if you, it's about a particular source of endogeneity. It's about the selection on the unobservables, and it turns out, if you think about it, you can tell a lot about the effect of the unobservable. If you think about a potential model where you can control for both observables and the unobservables, and the unobservables are usually thought in terms of abilities and preferences and so on, something that cannot be observed, but has an impact on earnings. And so if you think about the unobservables, you can basically, instead of trying to get rid of the bias, and so if you think about the variable of interest and you estimate the coefficient and you just run a simple OLS, obviously the coefficient is biased. Instead of trying to get rid of it using, say, an instrument, what you can do is you can try to figure out what this bias is. You can make inference about the magnitude of this bias. And to do that, you have to make some assumptions about the relative importance of the unobservables. And there are educated ways to do it. And one of the main parameters here is this coefficient of proportionality that governs the relationship between the contribution of between the relative importance of the unobservables and the observables. It's a very interesting literature, and it provides a lot of interesting insights into how endogeneity works and what, I think it's very interesting. There's a recent paper by Emily Oster, and it's a frequently quoted paper, and I think it's very insightful. So these are the basic results. So when you run an OLS and you do the IVs, they seem to be working well. I don't know. Basically, the result, at least the preliminary results, seem to support the idea that the relationship is causal. When you do the sensitivity-bound analysis and you make, so basically the way to interpret this table, I know it's a little bit difficult to interpret it, but basically as you start with the OLS estimate, and basically as you move across the diagonal, you make assumption, you basically assume that the relative importance of the unobservables is getting greater and greater, and the portion that they explain gets bigger and bigger. And the question is, how far do you want to go? And what the literature says is that if you stay, if you're not killing your OLS coefficient within the first 3 columns, you're doing okay. And you can see that it's only at the bottom where in the lower right-hand side corner where it gets within 1 or 2, 3 standard deviations. So I think I'm doing okay. I think it's the evidence that supports the causal relationship. I do all kinds of robustness checks, and an obvious one is to try to do the same things with all firms. Seems to be okay. I do a little bit of, I look at different high and low educated workers, but this is still something that has to be sorted out. I do the same thing for Canadian-born, and it's just a small, well, at least so far, it's a small part of the paper, but the results seem to be a lot more ambiguous. I have to think about it more. I don't really have good explanations how it works for the Canadian-born, so I have to spend quite a bit more time to think about it. So that's basically where I am now. It's like I said, it's a recent project, and there are still quite a few details to sort out. But there seem to be, at least the preliminary results tell me that the story that I gave you with the causal relationship between workplace immigrant concentration and earnings, it seems to be a plausible story. There's substantial evidence. There's part of the paper where I measure workplace concentration in Canada, and there's workplace separation between natives and immigrants, and it seems it's there, but it seems to be smaller than in some other countries for which I have results, like Sweden, for example, some Scandinavian countries. And there's a lot more work to be done, and that's it.